Marcos Oliveira, a seasoned district attorney, gripped the steering wheel tightly as he swerved into a parking space in a bustling downtown garage. He glanced at his watch, cursing under his breath. The meeting he was late for wasn't just any routine briefing. It was with a group of high-profile lawyers and city officials discussing a controversial case of police misconduct. Being late wasn't an option. His breath quickened as he cut the engine of his sleek, black luxury car, a far cry from the old beat-up sedan he used to drive before his career took off. His success was a symbol of hard work, but as a black man in America, he knew it wasn't a shield against the assumptions people made about him. The faint sound of city traffic hummed in the background, but Marcos was already preoccupied. Reaching for his briefcase, he instinctively patted his pocket. That's when the dread set in. His wallet, containing his driver's license, important credit cards, and most crucially, his ID badge that granted him access to the courthouse, was gone. He frantically checked his coat pockets, feeling the panic rise in his chest. "Not today. Please, not today," he muttered, throwing the briefcase onto the passenger seat and rummaging through the clutter of papers, folders, and old coffee cups scattered on the car's floor. He slammed his hand on the dashboard, a surge of frustration overtaking him. Of all days to lose his wallet, it had to be today. Sweat began to form on his forehead as he glanced again at the time. The clock was ticking, and every second lost searching for his wallet was one more nail in the coffin of his punctuality. But Marcos couldn't afford to rush into the courthouse without his identification. No one would believe that a man dressed in a suit, driving an expensive car, could forget something so basic. Even more troubling, he knew that without his ID, getting past security could turn into an ordeal of its own. As he leaned back, trying to remember where he might have last seen it, he didn't notice the police cruiser pulling into the lot behind him. Marcos's heart pounded in his chest as he resumed the desperate search for his missing wallet. Papers flew around the car's interior as he dug through the glove compartment, pushing aside old receipts and folders, his frustration mounting with each passing second. His fingers fumbled through the cracks of the seat cushions, hoping for a miracle. Come on," he whispered to himself, a nervous edge in his voice. The more he searched, the more the panic began to consume him. He knew that the meeting had already started, and the thought of walking into the courthouse without his badge made his stomach churn. The parking garage was dimly lit, the overhead lights casting eerie shadows through the windshield. The concrete structure echoed with the distant sounds of cars driving by and the occasional pedestrian walking past. But Marcos barely noticed any of this as he pushed through the chaos of his car, his mind racing. He knew what could happen if he walked into the courthouse without proper identification. He had seen how security treated others like him. Black men in suits, even with power and prestige, still regarded with suspicion. He couldn't afford any additional delays, not today. A soft beep startled him, breaking his focus. His phone buzzed with a notification. Glancing at the screen, he saw a reminder for the meeting. His stomach dropped. He was officially late now. Frustration turned into a wave of dread that washed over him. How could he, a respected district attorney, someone who had fought tirelessly for justice, be caught in such a mundane yet critical situation? Still, he didn't let himself give up. He took a deep breath, telling himself that if he just slowed down, he might retrace his steps. "Think, Marcos," he muttered, running a hand through his neatly cropped hair. He thought about the coffee shop he had stopped at earlier, the quick trip to the newsstand on the way to the parking lot, but nothing stood out. Then, just as he leaned down to check beneath the driver's seat, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror. It was a police cruiser, idling a few yards behind him. His heart sank, knowing what could happen next. Marcos watched as the police cruiser came to a stop behind his car. His initial reaction was a mix of curiosity and mild annoyance. He was already late and stressed about the missing wallet. The last thing he needed was an officer questioning him. He tried to brush it off, assuming it was a routine patrol. Maybe the officer was just passing through. But when the car door opened and a uniformed officer stepped out, his mood shifted. Something about the way the officer moved made Marcos uneasy. The officer was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his white skin almost glowing under the dim garage lights. His expression was stern, his posture rigid. Marcos had encountered enough police officers in his time to recognize the type. Heavily built, with an air of authority that felt more like intimidation. As the officer approached, Marcos noticed the badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. His mind immediately flashed to countless stories he had heard and read about black men being wrongly accused, harassed, and sometimes worse, all because of misunderstandings, or worse, prejudices. The officer's hand hovered near his holster as he walked over to Marcos's car. "What's going on here?" His voice was gruff, demanding, cutting through the tension in the air. Marcos, still half inside his car, straightened up and faced him, forcing a calm smile. "Good afternoon, officer. I'm just looking for my wallet. I think I dropped it in the car." The officer's eyes narrowed as he glanced over the luxury vehicle, then back to Marcos. "Looking for your wallet, huh?" His tone carried a heavy dose of skepticism. He didn't ask for further clarification, didn't ask if Marcos needed help. Instead, his gaze hardened as if already deciding that something wasn't right. Marcos felt the officer's gaze lingering on him longer than necessary, and suddenly, he was all too aware of the situation. Here he was, a black man, rummaging through a car. His own car? Yes, but to this officer, none of that likely mattered. He could feel the assumptions piling up in the air between them. "Yeah, I'm late for a meeting. I'm just trying to find my ID so I can get into the courthouse," Marcos explained, keeping his voice level. His instincts told him to be overly polite, careful. He had seen what happened when things escalated unnecessarily, and he wasn't going to let that happen to him today. The officer took a step closer. "Can I see some identification?" he demanded. Marcos swallowed, his pulse quickening. "That's the thing, officer. I lost my wallet. It has all my documents. That's why I'm looking for it," he explained, gesturing to the car in a way that felt overly defensive. The officer's face remained expressionless for a moment, but then a flicker of doubt crossed his features. "Step away from the car, sir," he said, his voice flat, but the underlying command was clear. Marcos hesitated. "Officer, I'm telling you, this is my car. I'm the district attorney." "Step away from the car," the officer interrupted, his hand moving closer to his holster. Marcos felt a surge of frustration and fear. He knew this could get ugly if he didn't handle it carefully. Slowly, he stepped away from the vehicle, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. The tension in the air thickened, and Marcos couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to spiral out of control. Marcos stood a few feet away from his car, hands slightly raised, trying to maintain his composure. The officer's eyes remained locked on him, full of suspicion. It was a familiar look, one Marcos had experienced throughout his life, despite all his professional achievements. He had prosecuted cases, stood in courtrooms, and even argued against the very type of misconduct he now sensed was unraveling right in front of him. "Look, officer, I know this doesn't look good," Marcos began, his voice steady but measured. "But this is my car. I'm the district attorney for this city. I'm just late for a meeting and—" The officer cut him off sharply. "If you're the district attorney, where's your ID?" Marcos sighed, the frustration beginning to bubble beneath his calm facade. "As I said, I lost my wallet. That's why I was searching the car when you came over." The officer's stance remained rigid, his hand now resting on the butt of his gun. Marcos could see the tension in his shoulders, the doubt hardening in his expression. "So, you expect me to believe that a district attorney just happens to be digging around in a luxury car, without any ID, looking suspicious as hell?" The officer's words were laced with accusation. Marcos felt his heart rate spike, a rush of heat creeping up his neck. "With all due respect, officer, this is a misunderstanding. There's no reason to escalate this. I can show you the registration in the glove compartment, or you can run the plates." "Step away from the vehicle," the officer barked, his voice loud enough to echo through the mostly empty garage. His stance shifted, becoming more confrontational. Marcos took a breath, trying to suppress the frustration rising inside him. "This really isn't necessary," he said, his voice controlled, but the fear was there now, gnawing at the edges of his calm. He couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just any officer misunderstanding a situation. This was an officer determined to see him as guilty before even trying to understand. The officer's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. I don't care who you say you are. Right now, all I see is someone suspicious who's refusing to cooperate. His hand hovered dangerously close to his holster, and Marcos knew that things were teetering on the edge. Marcos raised his hands higher, his heart pounding against his rib cage. I'm cooperating, officer. I'm standing here, just like you asked. He felt a cold sweat break out along his temples. Memories of other cases he had prosecuted, cases of excessive force, unjustified arrests, flashed through his mind. The officer didn't flinch. I need to see some ID. Without that, you're going to have to come with me. Marcos's frustration boiled over. I've already explained that I don't have my ID. What more do you want from me? His voice was still controlled, but there was an undeniable edge to it now. I want you to stop playing games, the officer shot back, his voice low, but menacing. He reached for his radio, preparing to call for backup. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Marcos realized that this was no longer just about finding his wallet or making his meeting. This was about control, about power dynamics that he, even as a district attorney, could not escape. He felt the weight of every decision in that moment, knowing that one wrong move could make this situation spiral into something much worse. I'm not resisting, Marcos said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos building inside him. I just want to resolve this calmly. But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes told Marcos everything he needed to know. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a standoff. Marcos stood still, his hands still raised slightly, his mind racing. He had faced hostile witnesses, combative lawyers, and intense courtroom battles, but nothing compared to the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest now. The officer's expression didn't waver. He was still eyeing Marcos like a threat. Even though Marcos had complied with every instruction, it was painfully clear that his words weren't being heard, that his identity and his explanation didn't matter in this moment. Officer, I'm telling you again, I don't have my wallet, Marcos repeated, trying to keep his voice calm, though the frustration was evident. It has all my documents, my driver's license, my courthouse ID. I'm not trying to give you a hard time. I just need to find it. The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. That's what they all say. I lost my ID. I'm not causing trouble, he said with a mocking tone, his hand still resting on the butt of his gun. But look at the situation from where I'm standing. You say you're the district attorney? Well, where's your proof? You could be anyone. Marcos took a deep breath, fighting the urge to snap back. He knew better. He'd prosecuted enough cases involving confrontations like this to understand how quickly things could go south. He felt trapped, knowing that the truth of his position meant little here. His success, his reputation, it all vanished in the face of this officer's assumptions. I understand how this looks, Marcos said, trying a different approach, one that might lower the tension. I know you're just doing your job, but I'm not a threat. This is a misunderstanding. I can show you where the registration is in the car, or you can run the plates. But the officer didn't move. He stared at Marcos as if the words were just noise. Sir, I don't have all day for this, the officer replied coldly. Step further back, away from the car. Marcos complied, taking another step away, his hands still visible. He felt the distance between himself and his car growing. Not just physically, but symbolically. His car, his success, the very things that should have signaled he belonged in this world, now felt like liabilities. His expensive suit and watch, his prestigious job title, all of it seemed irrelevant under the scrutinizing gaze of this officer, who had already judged him based on his skin color. The officer's impatience was palpable. Look, you say this is your car. You say you're the DA, but you don't have any ID on you. So, I'm left with two choices. Either you're telling me the truth, or you're full of it. And right now, I'm leaning toward the second option. Marcos felt his stomach churn. You can call the courthouse. They'll confirm who I am, he insisted. But he could tell the officer wasn't listening. The situation was slipping further from his control. The officer's hand twitched near his radio. I don't have time to call anyone, he said, his tone now sharp. You're coming with me to the station, and we'll sort this out there. Marcos's heart sank. Officer, that's not necessary. If you just give me a moment, I said, "Step away from the car," the officer barked, this time louder, his patience gone. The garage's dim lighting seemed to thicken the air, and the few cars parked nearby offered no witnesses, no escape from the officer's insistence. Marcos knew what was coming next. His attempts at reasoning had hit a wall. The officer didn't care about his position, his explanations, or his calm demeanor. To him, Marcos was just another suspect, a man who didn't belong. And now, without the crucial proof of his identity, the situation was spiraling further out of his control. The realization hit him hard. In the eyes of this officer, he was guilty until proven innocent. The air between them seemed to thicken as the silence stretched. Marcos knew he was walking a thin line. He had been calm, measured, and had done everything he could to defuse the situation. But the officer wasn't backing down. Marcos could see it in the way the man's hand hovered near his weapon, in the way his eyes flickered with suspicion and barely hidden aggression. Despite all his efforts, it wasn't enough. The uniform in front of him wasn't seeing a district attorney. He was seeing a black man who didn't belong in that luxury car, rummaging around with no ID. "Officer, please listen," Marcos tried one last time, his voice steady but with an edge of urgency now. "I've told you everything. This is my car. I've misplaced my wallet. You can check the registration, call the courthouse, do whatever you need to verify my identity. There's no need to escalate this." But the officer wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. He stared hard at Marcos, as if trying to find something in his demeanor that justified the growing tension. "I've heard enough," the officer finally said, his voice cold, authoritative. "Turn around. Put your hands on the hood of the car." Marcos blinked in disbelief. "What?" He felt the heat rising in his chest, a mix of anger and disbelief. He had seen this play out before, read about it, and now it was happening to him. He was being treated like a criminal for simply losing his wallet. "You heard me," the officer barked, stepping closer. "Put your hands on the car. Now." Marcos's jaw clenched, his frustration boiling over. He had fought his entire life to get to where he was, to earn the respect that came with his title, to represent justice in a system that often failed people who looked like him. But in this moment, none of that mattered. To this officer, his success, his accomplishments, were invisible. All the officer saw was a black man without an ID, and that was enough to make him a suspect. "Officer, this is ridiculous," Marcos said, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm the district attorney of this city. You're about to make a serious mistake." The officer smirked, a mocking look flashing across his face. "A mistake? You want to talk about mistakes? You're the one acting suspicious, refusing to cooperate. I'm just doing my job." "This isn't about cooperation," Marcos shot back, his frustration finally surfacing. "This is about the fact that you've already decided I'm guilty of something, without any proof. You're treating me like a criminal, when all I've done is lose my wallet." The officer's face hardened, and his hand moved to his radio. "I'm not going to argue with you," he said. "You can explain it all at the station." Marcos knew that the situation was dangerously close to spiraling out of control. His mind raced, thinking of the countless stories he had heard, of the men who hadn't made it out of these situations unscathed. He didn't want to be another statistic, another black man wrongfully detained. Or worse, because of an officer's racial bias. "Listen, officer," Marcos said, lowering his voice, trying to de-escalate things once more. "I'm not resisting. I'm telling you, if you just run the plates or make a call, this will all be cleared up. There's no need to take this any further." But the officer's mind was made up. "Turn around and put your hands on the car, or I will make you." Marcos's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced around, hoping that someone, anyone, might walk by and intervene, but the garage was eerily quiet. His pulse raced, and he could feel the situation slipping further out of his control. The officer took another step forward, and Marcos saw his hand inch toward his cuffs. "You've got 3 seconds. 1. Marcos's mind raced. If he complied, he would be humiliated, arrested, and dragged through the system like a common criminal. But if he resisted, if he made even the slightest wrong move, this officer might escalate things to a point of no return. 2. The decision felt impossible. There was no winning here, only survival. 3. Marcos had no choice. His mind screamed with frustration, but his body moved almost automatically. He turned slowly and placed his hands on the hood of his car, the cool metal beneath his palms a stark contrast to the heat of his anger. The humiliation was immediate and profound. How many times had he stood in courtrooms, defending justice, fighting for fairness, and now, here he was, treated like a criminal for nothing more than losing his wallet. Behind him, he heard the metallic sound of handcuffs being unsnapped from the officer's belt. "This is unnecessary," Marcos muttered, his voice laced with quiet fury. "You're making a huge mistake." The officer didn't respond. Instead, Marcos felt the cold steel of the cuffs clamp around his wrists. They were tight, uncomfortably so. The officer yanked his arms back with more force than necessary, and Marcos winced but said nothing. He knew any protest could escalate things further, and that was the last thing he wanted. As the cuffs clicked into place, the officer leaned in close. "You think you're above the law because you wear a suit and drive a fancy car?" His voice dripped with disdain. "You're just another guy breaking the rules. And now, you're going to see what happens." Marcos gritted his teeth, the injustice of the situation boiling inside him. "You're wrong. I'm the district attorney, and you're going to regret this," he said, unable to hide the anger in his voice. The officer let out a dry laugh, clearly unconvinced. "Sure, you are," he said sarcastically, before turning Marcos around and walking him toward the police car, the tight grip on his arm signaling that this officer enjoyed the power he wielded. The walk from his own car to the back of the police cruiser felt like a lifetime. Each step was heavy with the weight of his thoughts. How easily this had happened, how powerless he felt, and how this officer, blinded by his own prejudices, had refused to even consider the truth. Marcos had worked his entire life to rise above the stereotypes, to prove that he could succeed in a system that wasn't built for people like him. Yet here he was, in cuffs, being led to a police car because of the color of his skin and a missing wallet. As the officer pushed Marcos into the back seat of the cruiser, he couldn't help but feel the full weight of the situation. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a mistake. This was a stark reminder of the harsh reality that no matter how high he climbed, no matter how successful he became, he was still seen through the lens of race first. The doors slammed shut, and Marcos sat in the back of the cruiser, his hands cuffed tightly behind him, his thoughts racing. The officer hadn't even bothered to check the car's registration or verify his identity. He had made his judgment the moment he saw Marcos, and nothing else mattered after that. Marcos's heart pounded with a mix of anger and helplessness as he stared out of the window, his mind flashing through scenarios. What if this officer hadn't stopped at an arrest? What if things had gotten worse? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Marcos leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to calm the storm inside him. But then, suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps broke through the garage's eerie quiet. A woman's voice, panicked but familiar, rang out. "Wait, stop. That's Marcos Oliveira, the district attorney," she shouted. Marcos opened his eyes, startled. The officer froze mid-step, his hands still resting on his radio. He turned slowly toward the voice, his expression shifting from authority to uncertainty in a split second. The woman, a courthouse employee who had parked nearby and recognized him, rushed toward them, breathless. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "He's the DA. This is all a mistake." The officer's face drained of color as the reality of his error hit him. The words hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Marcos watched as the officer's confident posture faltered. For a moment, the garage was still, the echo of the woman's urgent plea reverberating through the space. The officer turned, his eyes darting between Marcos and the woman, his grip loosening on his radio. The certainty he had carried throughout the encounter seemed to evaporate in an instant. The woman, still catching her breath, stepped closer. "Do you know who he is?" "He's Marcos Oliveira, the district attorney," she repeated, her tone incredulous. Her eyes flicked to Marcos, and the concern in her expression deepened. "This is a huge mistake. You need to let him go, right now." The officer blinked, as though trying to process the situation. His face had lost its color, and the arrogance that had been present just moments before was replaced with something resembling panic. "District Attorney," he muttered, almost to himself. His hand, which had hovered confidently near his weapon just minutes ago, now shook slightly as he fumbled for his radio. He glanced down at Marcos, his expression shifting from suspicion to confusion and fear. Marcos remained silent, his wrists still cuffed behind him, the sting of the metal biting into his skin. He could see the officer's internal conflict, how quickly his certainty had been upended by the simple revelation of Marcos's title. But the damage was already done. Marcos's anger simmered beneath the surface, though he kept his expression calm, masking the storm of emotions that raged inside him. The officer finally raised the radio to his mouth, his voice shaky now. "This is Officer Davis. I need confirmation on a subject. Name is Marcos Oliveira. Claims to be the district attorney." There was a pause, his eyes darting nervously toward Marcos, as though hoping this was all some strange misunderstanding, that it wasn't as serious as it suddenly seemed. Within moments, a voice crackled over the radio, confirming, "Marcos Oliveira is indeed the district attorney. Repeat, district attorney." The officer's face fell. The weight of his actions was crashing down on him, and he knew it. Without a word, he quickly stepped forward, reaching for the handcuffs around Marcos's wrists. "Sir, I'm sorry," he stammered, his earlier bravado completely gone. His fingers fumbled with the key, struggling to unlock the cuffs. Marcos didn't move, his jaw tight, his gaze steady on the officer. The apologies meant little to him now. The humiliation of being handcuffed, of being treated like a criminal despite his position, wouldn't be erased by a few words of regret. He knew all too well that if that courthouse employee hadn't intervened, this situation could have ended much worse. The cuffs finally clicked open, and Marcos rubbed his wrists, feeling the burn where the metal had dug into his skin. He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. The garage seemed smaller now, suffocating under the weight of what had just happened. The officer took a step back, his face a mask of regret and fear. "I didn't realize. I didn't know," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just doing my job." Marcos took a breath, his voice calm but laced with the weight of his anger. "No," he said quietly. "You weren't just doing your job. You made assumptions. You saw a black man, and you made a decision before asking the right questions." The officer's face flushed with shame. This could have ended very differently," Marcos interrupted, his voice measured, but the intensity of his words hit hard. "Do you understand that? If she hadn't shown up, you would have taken me to the station, humiliated me, because of your assumptions." The woman, standing off to the side, watched the scene unfold in stunned silence. The weight of Marcos's words hung heavy in the air. I'm sorry, sir," the officer muttered, unable to meet Marcos's gaze. Marcos stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. "You need to think about what you've done, about why you did it." The officer nodded, his face pale, his confidence shattered. "Yes, sir. I understand," he said quietly, but Marcos wondered if he truly did. If any of this would actually change the way the officer saw people who looked like him. Marcos turned to the courthouse employee, offering her a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded back, still visibly shaken by what she had witnessed. The tension in the air had shifted, but it hadn't lifted. As the officer stepped back, his expression contorted with regret and fear, Marcos could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. The cold, sterile environment of the garage was suddenly overwhelming, and the echo of what had just transpired seemed to hang in the space between them. Marcos stood tall, but the emotional toll of what had just happened bore down on him. He had faced racism before, countless times, but this was different. This was personal. He had been stripped of his dignity, reduced to nothing but a threat in the eyes of a man whose job was to protect and serve. And despite his success, his position, and his standing in the community, none of that had mattered. In that moment, to this officer, he had been just another suspect. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if searching for something to say, something that would undo the damage. His bravado had evaporated, replaced by a deep sense of panic. "I'm sorry, sir," he said again, this time more earnestly, though his voice trembled. I didn't realize it was you." Marcos's eyes narrowed. "And if it wasn't me?" His voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it. "If I wasn't the district attorney, what then? Would this still be happening? Would you still be apologizing?" The officer opened his mouth, but no words came. He stood there, his face flushed with guilt, his hands fidgeting nervously. The truth was obvious to both of them. Marcos didn't need to hear an answer because the answer was already clear. The officer hadn't seen a man who deserved respect. He had seen a black man in an expensive car and made a judgment call, a dangerous, biased one. "You didn't just make a mistake," Marcos continued, his voice tightening with the weight of his anger. "You let your prejudices guide your actions. You saw me, and you made a decision based on my skin color, not my actions. And you didn't even give me the benefit of the doubt." He took a step closer, his presence towering over the now visibly shaken officer. "How many other people have you treated this way? How many others haven't had someone show up at the right moment to prove they weren't guilty?" The officer's face paled, and he swallowed hard, struggling to find words that could repair the damage. I don't know what to say," he admitted quietly, the weight of his actions sinking in. "I was wrong. I should have listened." Marcos nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, you were wrong," he said, his voice cold but steady. "But an apology isn't enough. What you did today could have cost me more than my dignity. It could have cost me my life or my freedom, all because you couldn't see past your own biases." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, the officer now looking at the ground, ashamed. The power dynamics had shifted, but the damage was done. Marcos had been handcuffed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal, despite everything he had worked for. He had faced the ugly truth once again. No matter how successful he became, the color of his skin still made him a target. "I'll file a report," the officer said, his voice barely a whisper now, as if hoping that those words could offer some form of restitution. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Marcos shook his head, his anger giving way to a deeper, more exhausted emotion. "It's not about the report. It's about you learning from this. It's about understanding that your actions have real consequences. It's about knowing that next time, there might not be someone there to tell you who I am before things go too far." The officer nodded, still staring at the ground. "I understand," he whispered. Marcos sighed, the exhaustion of the day catching up to him. "I hope you do." For a moment, the garage was silent, the only sound being the distant hum of city traffic beyond its walls. The officer stood there, his face a mask of shame, while Marcos, finally freed from the cuffs, took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. Without another word, Marcos turned and began walking toward the courthouse. The woman who had saved him from further humiliation stood to the side, watching him go with concern etched across her face. She didn't say anything, but her presence was a reminder that, without her, the day could have turned out much worse. As Marcos walked away, he felt the sting of the encounter linger in his chest. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern, a reminder of how deep the roots of prejudice ran in society. Even in his position of power, even as a district attorney, he wasn't immune to the biases that had plagued him his entire life. As Marcos made his way toward the courthouse, the weight of the incident pressed heavily on him. Each step felt slower than the last, the echo of the encounter with the officer replaying in his mind. His wrists still throbbed from where the cuffs had dug into his skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll. Despite everything he had achieved, his education, his career, his success, he had just been reduced to a suspect based on nothing more than the color of his skin. The courthouse loomed ahead, but Marcos paused outside the entrance, taking a moment to gather himself. His mind raced with thoughts, questions, and frustrations that he knew wouldn't easily go away. How many others, he wondered, had been through what he just experienced? How many didn't have someone to intervene? How many were left to suffer the full consequences of being misjudged, mistreated, or worse. He wasn't just reflecting on his own experience now. He was thinking about the countless stories of black men and women who had been victims of systemic racism. He had read their stories in the news, seen them in the courtroom, and now, once again, lived through one of his own. His position as a district attorney had not protected him from this reality. It was a sobering reminder that the problem wasn't just individual officers, but a system that allowed such biases to persist unchecked. Inside, Marcos knew he would have to address what happened. The incident couldn't be brushed aside. This was bigger than just a moment of humiliation. It was about the broader implications of power, bias, and accountability in law enforcement. The officer might face disciplinary action, but Marcos knew that this wouldn't be enough. This wasn't about punishing one man. It was about addressing a system that allowed such actions to occur repeatedly. Later that day, back in his office, Marcos sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the window. His thoughts swirled around the day's events and the decisions he would now have to make. He could file a formal complaint, pursue legal action, and ensure that the officer was held accountable. But the real challenge, he realized, was ensuring that the incident sparked a meaningful conversation about systemic racism, one that could lead to real change, not just a temporary solution. The door to his office opened quietly, and one of his colleagues stepped in. "Marcos, are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle but concerned. Marcos looked up, his eyes tired but determined. "I'm fine," he replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. "But we need to do something about this. It can't keep happening." She nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. "What do you have in mind?" Marcos leaned back in his chair, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. "We need to talk about the broader issue, how officers are trained, how they're held accountable. I'm not just going after him. This is about making sure this doesn't happen to the next person, or the one after that." His colleague nodded again, this time with a sense of shared purpose. "You're right. We'll do whatever we can." As the conversation continued, Marcos's mind drifted back to the moment when the officer had placed the cuffs on his wrists. That feeling of being stripped of his humanity, reduced to a mere stereotype, was something that would stay with him for a long time. It wasn't something he could easily shake off, and it wasn't something he wanted to forget. It would serve as a reminder, not just of the work he still needed to do as a district attorney, but of the fight that still lay ahead for racial equality in a system that was far from fair. The next day, as Marcos stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his suit before heading back to work, he caught a glimpse of the faint marks left by the handcuffs. They were barely visible, but they were there, a physical reminder of the day's events. He looked at his reflection, straightened his tie, and steeled himself. There was work to be done, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been in his position. Because in the end, this wasn't just about him. It was about every black person who had been wrongly judged, every person who had been stopped, questioned, or detained simply because of how they looked. Marcos knew that his position gave him the power to fight back, to challenge the system that had let this happen to him. And he intended to use that power for good. As he left his apartment and walked toward the courthouse, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The incident had shaken him, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had only solidified his resolve. There was a long road ahead, but Marcos was ready to walk it, knowing that change didn't come easily, but it came faster when people like him fought for it. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and watch this next story that's really exciting.